In this class, we can see about oogenesis. What is oogenesis? It is the formation of haploid female gametes called ova from the diploid egg mother cell or oogonia in the ovary. Okay, so oogenesis is the formation of haploid female gamete called ova from the diploid egg mother cell or oogonia in the ovary. When we say about oogenesis, it is different from that of spermatogenesis. We have seen that the spermatogenesis begins at puberty, isn't it? But the process of oogenesis begins in the early embryonic stage itself. Okay. Oogenesis is initiated during the embryonic development stage itself. So during the embryonic stage, in each ovary, a couple of million gamete mother cells or the oogonia are formed. Okay, so inside the fetal ovary, what will be formed? A couple of million gamete mother cell or oogonia is formed. Okay, and no more oogonia will be formed after birth. Only in the fetal ovary oogonia will be formed, and after birth of the child no more oogonia will be formed. Okay. The oogonial cells start dividing and enter into the prophase 1 of first meiosis. Okay, and it will not complete the prophase 1 but get temporarily arrested at that stage itself, and now the cells are called as primary oocytes. Okay, so what is primary oocytes? The oogonial cells, they begin to divide and they enter into the prophase 1 of meiosis 1 and get temporarily arrested at that stage, and now it is said to be as primary oocyte. Okay, each primary oocyte will be surrounded by a layer of granulosa cell, and now it is said to be as the primary follicle. Here you can see the primary follicle. So actually, what is that primary follicle? The primary oocyte will be surrounded by a layer of granulosa cells, and now it is said to be as primary follicle. So where is the primary oocyte now present? It is present within the primary follicle. Okay, a large number of these primary follicles will be degenerating during the phase from birth to puberty. Okay, so after birth till they attain puberty, till the female attain puberty, a large number of these primary follicles will be degenerating. Okay, so at the time of puberty, if we say, only 60,000 to 80,000 primary follicles will be present in each ovary. Okay, at the time of puberty, only 60,000 to 80,000 primary follicles will be present in each ovary. Okay, now the primary follicles are surrounded by more and more layers of granulosa cells, and now it is said to be a secondary follicle. Okay, so when the primary follicles get surrounded by more layers of granulosa cells, a theca will be formed, another layer, protective layer, will be formed, and now it is said to be as the secondary follicles. Okay, so here you can see the secondary follicle. Okay, so you can see more and more layer of granulosa cells are present. Okay, now this secondary follicle transforms into a tertiary follicle. It will be converted into a tertiary follicle. Okay, here you can see the tertiary follicle. So how it is converted into a tertiary follicle? A fluid filled cavity will be developing. Okay, a fluid filled cavity develops, and that fluid filled cavity is called the antrum. A fluid filled cavity called the antrum develops in the secondary follicle, so that it is transformed into the tertiary follicle. Okay, now the theca layer, I told a theca layer will be formed due to more accumulation of granulosa cells in the primary follicle, so that a secondary follicle is formed, isn't it? Now the theca layer will be differentiated into an inner theca interna and an outer theca externa. So in the tertiary follicle, the theca layer will be differentiated into an inner theca interna and an outer theca externa. Okay, at this stage the primary oocyte which is present within the tertiary follicle, it will be growing in size and it will be completing its first meiotic division. Okay, so in the primary follicle, secondary follicle, and inside the tertiary follicle, the cell which is present is the primary oocyte. Okay, so when it has entered into the tertiary follicle, what happens to the primary oocyte? It will grow in its size and it will be completing its first meiotic division. Okay, the first meiotic division is unequal division. As a result, two unequal sized cells are formed. Why we say it as unequal division? The division leads to two cells which are not equal in size. Okay, one cell will be large in size and another cell will be very small in size. The large cell is called the secondary oocyte and the small cell is called the first polar body. Okay, so the large cell is called the secondary oocyte, which is haploid in nature because it is formed as a result of meiosis 1. And the small tiny cell is called the first polar body. It is also haploid in nature. Okay. Now the secondary oocyte is large in size because it will be having more amount of the nutrient rich cytoplasm in it. Okay, and the first polar body will be very small because it will be having only very little amount of cytoplasm in it. Okay. Now what happens to the tertiary follicle? It will be changing into the mature Graafian follicle. Okay, it becomes the mature Graafian follicle, and the secondary oocyte which is present inside the Graafian follicle will be developing another membrane around it, and that membrane is called zona pellucida. What is it called? Zona pellucida. Okay. So inside the Graafian follicle, the secondary oocyte forms a new membrane called the zona pellucida. Okay. Now the Graafian follicle will be rupturing. Okay. Here you can see it ruptures and it releases the ovum here. Okay. The Graafian follicle ruptures and the ovum, actually the secondary oocyte will be released out from the ovary. Generally, we say it as the ovum is released, but actually the secondary oocyte will be released from the ovary, and that process is called ovulation. So, what is ovulation? The rupturing of Graafian follicle to release the secondary oocyte or ovum from the ovary is said to be as ovulation. Okay. I hope you might have understood this. Now next we can see the schematic representation of oogenesis. Okay. This is the schematic representation of oogenesis, and as we have seen in spermatogenesis, here also it is divided into three phases: multiplication phase, growth phase, and the maturation phase. In the multiplication phase, which takes place in the fetal ovary, the primary germ cells which are present in the fetal ovary will be undergoing mitotic division. As a result, a large number of egg mother cell, germ mother cell, or oogonia will be formed. Okay, so this oogonia or the egg mother cell are formed as a result of mitotic division. Okay, and as it is mitosis, all these cells will be diploid in nature. That means they will be having 46 chromosomes in them. Okay, now what happens to this oogonia? It will be entering into the first meiosis, isn't it? Prophase 1 of first meiosis and gets temporarily arrested, isn't it? And now it is said to be as the primary oocyte, isn't it? Actually, it enters into the next phase called the growth phase. Okay. In the growth phase, what happens to this primary oocyte? It will be surrounded by primary follicle. Then more and more granulosa cells will be again surrounding it, and it forms the secondary follicle. Then a fluid-filled cavity will be formed. It forms the tertiary follicle, and at last the Graafian follicle. So the growth of that oocyte occurs. Okay, the primary oocyte will be going on increasing in its size, thus growth occurs. So we can say this phase as the growth phase. But the cell is not undergoing any division, only growth is taking place. So it is also diploid in nature. That means it is having 46 chromosomes. Okay. Then what happens towards the puberty? What happens to this primary oocyte? It will be completing its first meiosis, isn't it? And I told this first meiotic division is unequal division. So one large cell called the secondary oocyte and a tiny polar body will be formed. Okay, a large cell called the secondary oocyte and this tiny polar body is formed. Now this secondary oocyte and the polar body are haploid in nature and they are having only 23 chromosomes. Why? Because they are formed as a result of completion of first meiotic division. Okay. Now at this stage only we have seen that ovulation occurs. The Graafian follicle will rupture and the secondary oocyte or the ovum will be released out. Actually it is not the ovum, it is the secondary oocyte which is released out of the ovary by the rupturing of Graafian follicle. Okay, and that process is called ovulation. Now why the secondary oocyte is large in size? Because it is retaining more amount of the nutrient rich cytoplasm. Okay. Now what happens to this secondary oocyte and the tiny first polar body? Both undergo second meiosis. Okay. Both of them will undergo the second meiosis. Now, actually, if second meiosis should take place, the secondary oocyte should come in contact with the sperm. When a sperm touches the secondary oocyte, it gets activated and it completes the second meiotic division. Okay. As a result, a large cell called the ovum and another tiny second polar body will be formed. Is it clear? When a sperm comes in contact with the secondary oocyte, it undergoes the second meiosis and it produces two unequal cells. The large cell which is having more amount of the nutrient rich cytoplasm is said to be as the ovum and the small cell is the tiny second polar body. Okay. Thus an ovum is formed as a result of oogenesis. So we can say only one ovum will be produced at the end of one oogenesis. Okay, but in spermatogenesis we can say whenever one cell is undergoing spermatogenesis, at the end 4 haploid sperms can be produced. But when one cell undergoes oogenesis, at the end it can produce only one ovum. Okay. Now what happens to this polar body? They are not essential for any purpose, isn't it? So what happens after the second meiotic division? All the polar bodies will get degenerated because they cannot develop into any other structure, so they will be degenerated. Is it clear? So this is about oogenesis.